Welcome to another deep dive. And this one is a chilling mystery, I think.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. It's 1986, Los Angeles,
Okay.
the notorious Skid Row.
Yeah.
A string of 10 murders in just over a month
Wow.
left the city on edge. And what's really interesting is we're exploring this case after the killer, Michael Player, took his own life.
So it's a puzzle with like a missing piece, right? We don't get to hear from him. He's Michael Player, also known as the Skid Row Slayer, committed suicide before authorities could fully unravel his motives. So we're left with a lot of questions and the unsettling feeling that some answers might be lost forever.
Yeah, and we're going to be going through excerpts from the Wikipedia article on Michael Player that you provided, and we're going to try and piece together this case. On the surface, it seems pretty straightforward. 10 murders, seemingly connected, and a killer who kind of took himself out of the equation.
Right.
But when you dig deeper, things get a lot more complicated.
Exactly. We have the who and the how, but the why remains elusive. And that why is what makes this case so fascinating and so disturbing.
Yeah, so right from the start, we run into a roadblock. Details about Player's early life are pretty scarce. We know he was born in 1960.
Okay?
But that's about it. No childhood stories, no defining moments that might hint at this darkness to come.
It's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing, right? Was there something in his past, some trauma or a pivotal event that set him on this path? We simply don't know. But what we do know is that he lived under the alias Marcus Nisby and had a significant criminal history.
Yeah, so the record paints a picture of a man who was no stranger to the wrong side of the law. So we see a robbery conviction in the early 80s, an arrest for attempted theft in 83, illegal weapons possession in 84, even parole violations. It's a pattern of escalating offenses, which always makes you wonder, was this a slow descent into something much darker?
Yeah, it's definitely a red flag, and it's something we see often in criminal profiling. Those early offenses can sometimes be indicators of a deeper underlying issue, a simmering rage, or a disregard for the law that can escalate over time.
And then September 1986 comes, and the killing spree begins.
Okay?
The first victim is 54-year-old Rudolfo Roque. He's shot in the back of the head, execution style. But here's where it gets interesting. Roque wasn't homeless.
Oh, wow.
He was actually visiting Los Angeles from San Diego.
That detail throws a wrench into the simple narrative of a man targeting vulnerable individuals on Skid Row, right? Could there have been another motive at play? Was Roque a random target of opportunity, or was there some unknown connection between him and Player?
And this wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment act. Over the next month, Player claims 9 more victims.
Wow.
Most of them homeless individuals in Skid Row. Imagine the fear that must have gripped that community knowing that a killer was stalking their streets.
Yeah. Skid Row, for those unfamiliar, is a neighborhood in downtown Los Angeles known for its large homeless population. It's a place where people often end up after facing extreme hardship. Job loss, addiction, mental health issues. It's a community struggling for survival, and that makes them incredibly vulnerable to someone like Player.
Yeah, and he doesn't hesitate to exploit that vulnerability. Men like Rick Stamps, 66 years old, Rogelio Servin, only 31, Joseph Griffin, David Towns, Marshall Singer, Christopher Boyle, Leon Gaines, Wayne Ellis, each one shot while they slept, most in the back of the head.
Wow.
The brutality, the cold-bloodedness of it all, it's just staggering.
Yeah, the execution-style killings are usually chilling. It suggests a level of control, a deliberate intent to not just kill, but to dehumanize the victims. And that raises another important question. Could Player's choice of weapon and method be linked to his past experiences, perhaps stemming from his time in prison?
There's another detail that stands out too, the case of Chang Kang, a 23-year-old who, like Roque, wasn't homeless.
Interesting.
He was visiting from Texas and ends up becoming another victim in this terrifying spree. It makes you wonder if there's a connection we're missing, some common thread between these two victims that seems so different from the others.
It's a question that begs for an answer, but unfortunately it's an answer that Player took with him to the grave.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the turning point in this case, Terrence Dunn.
Okay.
On October 9, 1986, Michael Player attacks Terrence Dunn.
Okay.
But Dunn miraculously survives. Not only does he survive, but he manages to provide a description of his attacker to the police. Can you imagine the courage it must have taken to face your attacker, to fight back, and then to help the authorities build a case against him?
That is incredibly brave. And Dunn's survival was a pivotal moment in the investigation. His description led to the creation of a composite sketch, which played a key role in eventually identifying Player. And this is where things take another unexpected turn. Just one day after Dunn's attack, Michael Player commits suicide in a Los Angeles hotel room. It seems like he knew the walls were closing in. When police searched his apartment, they found blood-stained shoes and 2 pistols, a .38 and a .22 caliber. Ballistics testing, which examines the unique markings left on bullets by a specific gun, confirmed that these were the weapons used in the murders.
And Terrence Dunn, that incredibly brave survivor, identified Player from a photograph, solidifying the connection between Player and the killings.
In February of 1987, LAPD Chief Daryl Gates officially announced that Michael Player was responsible for all 10 murders. The case was closed, but the questions lingered. What drove him to commit these acts? Why did he choose those specific victims? And what ultimately led him to take his own life? We'll delve deeper into these questions and try to make sense of this complex and tragic case when we come back. Okay, so we're back. And even with all the facts laid out in front of us, this case, it's like a tangled knot. Michael Player, he took his secrets with him when he committed suicide, and now we're left to kind of piece together his motives from the fragments of his life and his crimes.
Right. It's a frustrating reality for investigators and those seeking closure in cases like this, right? We're left to sift through the evidence, looking for patterns, connections, anything that might shed light on the darkness that consumed Michael Player.
Yeah. And so we know he preyed on the vulnerable in Skid Row, but the fact that two of his victims aren't homeless, that kind of throws a wrench into the whole easy prey theory. What are your thoughts on that? Could there have been something else drawing him to Skid Row? Maybe some twisted sense of power or control?
Well, Skid Row, unfortunately, has a long and dark history of attracting predators, right? It's a place where people often fall through the cracks of society, and that can create a sense of lawlessness, a feeling that crimes committed there might go unnoticed or unpunished.
Yeah, and it wasn't that long ago that Vaughn Greenwood, the Skid Row stabber, terrorized the area, preying on homeless individuals. Do you think Player could have been influenced by that history, perhaps even seeking to emulate Greenwood's crimes?
It's a chilling thought, right? The idea of a cycle of violence, one predator inspiring the next. But even if there's no direct connection, Skid Row's reputation as a dangerous place certainly made it easier for Player to operate in the shadows.
Let's go back to the execution-style killings, the shots to the back of the head. It's so calculated, so devoid of emotion. What do you think that tells us about Player's state of mind?
Well, that level of precision, that detachment from the act itself, could point to a couple of things. It might suggest a deep-seated rage, a need to dominate and control his victims, or it could be a sign of psychopathy, a lack of empathy or remorse.
And Player also had a history of using aliases, evading the law. That level of cutting doesn't exactly scream impulsive rage, does it?
No, it suggests a degree of premeditation, a calculated approach to his crimes. He chose his victims carefully, he planned his attacks, and he managed to stay under the radar for over a month while the body count was rising.
So we're left with a lot of maybes, a lot of potential explanations, but no definitive answers. And that brings us back to Player's suicide. Do you think it was an act of remorse, a way to avoid facing justice, or something else entirely?
It's interesting that he chose to end his life the day after Terrence Dunn survived his attack and provided a description to the police. Was it the fear of being caught, the realization that his time was up, that pushed him over the edge?
Yeah, the timing is definitely suspicious. But what about the method, though? He chose to shoot himself, just like he shot his victims. It almost seems like a final act of control, a way of ending things on his own terms.
Well, suicide is a complex act, often driven by a combination of factors. It's possible that guilt or shame played a role, or maybe he simply couldn't bear the thought of facing the consequences of his actions. Unfortunately, we don't have a suicide note or any other indication of his thoughts in those final moments.
So we're left with a chilling echo of the violence that defined his life. He chose to take his secrets to the grave, leaving behind a trail of broken lives and unanswered questions.
And that's what makes cases like this so haunting, right? We can analyze the evidence, we can speculate about motives, but we can never truly know what went on inside Michael Player's mind. The human psyche is a labyrinth, and sometimes even the most skilled investigators can't find their way out.
We're left with the victims, their families, and a community forever marked by this tragedy. What do you think are the lasting impacts of a case like this, especially on a place like Skid Row?
The impact of these killings on Skid Row would have been profound. Beyond the immediate trauma and grief, there's a lasting sense of fear, a loss of trust, and a deep wound in the fabric of the community.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities faced by those living on the margins of society. They're often overlooked, forgotten, and left to fend for themselves in a system that can feel rigged against them.
And that's something we need to address, not just in the aftermath of tragedies like this, but in a more proactive and compassionate way, right? How do we support those who are struggling? How do we create a safety net that catches people before they fall through the cracks?
These are questions that extend far beyond this specific case. They're about social responsibility, empathy, and recognizing that everyone deserves a chance at a decent life, regardless of their circumstances. We'll explore these larger questions and try to find some sense of hope amidst the darkness when we come back. So we've spent a lot of time dissecting the details of Michael Player's crimes, trying to understand, his motivations, but we're left with more questions than answers. And it's a reminder that even when a case is closed, the impact of these tragedies continues.
Yeah, absolutely. The victims, their families, the Skid Row community as a whole are left to grapple with the trauma and the fear long after the headlines fade. These kinds of events, they leave deep scars, both on individuals and on communities.
And it's not just physical scars, right? It's emotional and psychological ones as well. That sense of safety, the trust in your surroundings, it's shattered when someone like Player comes along.
Yeah, it's especially devastating for a community like Skid Row, which already faces so many challenges, right? Poverty, homelessness, addiction, mental health issues. These are complex problems, and they create an environment where people are more susceptible to violence and exploitation.
Yeah, it's a tragic cycle and one that we as a society need to confront. It's not enough to just react to these tragedies. We need to be proactive
Right.
in addressing the root causes, creating a safety net that prevents people from falling through the cracks.
I think it starts with empathy, recognizing the humanity of everyone, regardless of their circumstances. It's about understanding that people end up on Skid Row for a variety of reasons, many of them beyond their control. They deserve our compassion, not our judgment.
Yeah, and that compassion needs to translate into action. We need to invest in affordable housing, mental health services, addiction treatment, job training, all of these things that are essential in creating a society where everyone has a chance
Yeah.
to thrive.
It's also crucial that law enforcement works to build trust with communities like Skid Row, right? Too often there's a sense of us versus them, a divide that makes it difficult to address these complex issues.
Yeah, there needs to be a shift in mindset, moving away from simply policing these communities to actually partnering with them, building bridges, not walls.
Absolutely. And it's also important to remember that the vast majority of people experiencing homelessness are not criminals, right? They're victims of circumstance, and they deserve our support, not our suspicion.
What about the families of the victims? They're left to pick up the pieces, mourn their loved ones, try to make sense of this senseless violence. How do they even begin to heal?
It's a long and difficult journey, and there's no easy answer. Grief counseling, support groups, community outreach programs can all play a role
Right.
in helping families cope with the trauma and loss.
And it's important for society as a whole to remember these victims, to honor their lives, and to acknowledge the impact of these crimes. We can't let them become just another statistic.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important takeaways from this deep dive, right? The need to remember, to learn, and to act. The case of Michael Player is a chilling reminder of the darkness that can exist, but it's also a call to action.
It's a challenge we must all accept. We need to work together to address the root causes of violence, to support those who are struggling, and to create a society where everyone feels safe, valued, and respected.
It's a long road, but it's a journey worth taking. And as we conclude this deep dive, I hope you, the listener, are left with a sense of hope, a belief that even in the face of such darkness, we can still find the light.
And that light can start with each one of us. Choose compassion over judgment, empathy over apathy, and action over indifference. Let's work together to create a world where tragedies like this one become a distant memory, a lesson learned, and a reminder of the power of human resilience and the hope for a brighter future.